Religious experiences are often private, but sometimes they involve groups, where multiple people experience the same event at the same time. Even more rare are mass religious experiences, where hundreds, even thousands, claim to witness the same supernatural phenomenon at the same time. In 1968, in Zeitoun, Egypt, mass religious experiences happened. Thousands of people reported seeing the Virgin Mary above a Coptic Orthodox church night after night. The crowds grew so large that the Egyptian government and the church launched investigations. And to this day, no naturalistic explanation has held up to scrutiny. Today I'm joined by Dr. Travis Dumsday to discuss his book on this topic. His book is titled The Marian Apparitions at Zeitoun, an Evidential Inquiry. Together we'll explore the history of these remarkable events, critically examine the failed naturalistic theories, and unpack his argument for why the mass religious experiences at Zeitoun provide powerful evidence for the supernatural. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian. Let's dive in.
I've been interested in religious experiences in general for a long time, and in particular, different academic disciplines, as you know, approach religious experiences from different angles, and they study different aspects of them. But within philosophy of religion, what we're mostly concerned about when we're looking at religious experience is their evidential value. Right? Do religious experiences actually provide good evidence for the reality of the supernatural, or for some sort, particular sort of supernatural reality, God or angels or whatever it might be? So I've done some work over the years on the evidential status of religious experiences. And one of the issues I've dealt with in that literature a little bit over the years is the distinction between what's sometimes called private religious experiences versus group or intersubjective religious experiences. Right, so a private religious experience would be one where an individual is having some kind of what they think is an encounter with a spiritual being, and they're the only person that's having that experience, right? So this might be, a person praying privately at home, and they hear a voice or see a vision or feel a presence, that kind of thing. But even if they happen to be in a public place, if they're sitting in church or something and have an experience like that, and nobody else around them does, again, it'll be considered a private religious experience, even if there happen to be other people around, because they're the only one having it. And of course, that's by far the most common kind of religious experience. Religious experiences themselves are quite common across the population, and mostly they are private. But there's also this phenomenon of group or intersubjective religious experiences, where several people have what appears to be the same encounter at the same time. So maybe you've got three people sitting in a room, and they all hear the same voice or see a vision or whatever it might be. You can also have slightly more complex phenomena where you might get, let's say you've got a dozen people in a room, and six people see the angel and hear the angel tell them something, right? But then there's another few people in the room who hear the voice but don't see anything. And maybe there's another few people who, feel a presence but don't have anything more dramatic happen. And maybe there's a couple of people who don't see or experience anything. And so you can get experiences like that where they might be referred to as partially or variably intersubjective, where it's some members of a group have a shared experience, but not everybody, or they have experiences that are similar to some degree, but not everybody has exactly the same experience. So these things can get pretty complex. But I find that in general, these intersubjective religious experiences are particularly interesting from an evidential perspective because they're more difficult to account for using some of the standard naturalistic explanations. Right? Private religious experiences, there's any number of psychological or psychosocial explanations that might account for some or all of what's going on. Right? If I hear a voice, maybe it's because I'm having a hallucination. I'm in the first stages of some kind of mental illness, or there could be any number of internal explanations to account for what went on. Some of those explanations, though, are tougher to run for a group experience, particularly if everybody is experiencing the same thing at the same time. It looks like certain other classes of explanation might be required for what was happening there, maybe some kind of a hoax or something. But it's tougher oftentimes to account for what's happening in those situations using some of the classical kinds of explanation, like psychological or psychosocial. And so intersubjective experiences are particularly interesting. And of course, the larger a group you're dealing with, you might think that there's an even greater evidential import for the experience, right? If you've got two or three people who claim to have experienced the same thing at the same time, well, maybe only one person is really experiencing something, but the other two are sort of so under their sway that they came to convince themselves that they too experienced the same thing at the same time, right? The folie à deux kind of phenomenon that comes up sometimes in the psychology literature. But if you're dealing with 100 or 1,000 people who seem to be experiencing the same thing at the same time, that's often tougher to account for. So, and what's particularly distinctive about the Zeitoun events is that this is a situation where you do have, in some cases, tens of thousands of people experiencing the same thing at the same time. And the question is, well, what accounts for that? Are there plausible naturalistic explanations to explain what was going on in these scenarios? Or are these events genuinely good evidence for the reality of the supernatural? And when I'd heard of the Zeitoun events years ago, and I've referenced them periodically in other writing I've done on religious experience over the years, but I never really dug into them in any detail. And so I finally had an opportunity to do that and really dig into the literature that was available. And as I did, I became more and more impressed with these events and sort of more and more surprised that they're not more widely known. Because outside of the Coptic community and the Coptic diaspora around the world, they're not that widely known. And so, yeah, that was the central reason I wrote the book, is just to sort of shine a spotlight what I think are some very interesting events that philosophers or people in general, I think, should take an interest in.
Yeah. I'll briefly mention what makes me interested in this. It's similar to yours, but I'll add a little extra piece. And then I want to make it really clear to the viewers, like, what the payoff is if they watch this whole interview. So what makes me interested in it, or I think my first exposure to these, was in the context of discussions on the resurrection of Jesus, when the point would be made that groups experienced the resurrected Jesus. I think I first heard it from maybe Bart Ehrman. He mentioned, well, what do you, if you're going to say that groups experienced the resurrected Jesus, so that's evidence that he really did rise from the dead, do you say the same thing about the Virgin Mary? It seems like groups experienced her, and at least Protestants, I would consider myself a Protestant. I think you're Eastern Orthodox. Am I correct about that?
Right, Orthodox,
yeah. At least Protestants might be a little uncomfortable being like, yeah, the Virgin Mary appeared to a bunch of people. So that initially got me interested, because typically I've heard maybe Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, some of these New Testament scholars that write on the resurrection of Jesus, they've said group hallucinations don't happen. But then somebody like Bart Ehrman comes along and says, well, what do you do with Marian Apparitions? So that was my first exposure to it. And I've been interested in it since then. And I was really excited when I saw, hey, you've written a whole book on the topic where you look very carefully at the explanations that have been put forward and some of the history of the events as well. So that's what got me interested. And I think what my viewers, if they watch until the end of the interview, the payoff will be they will not only have a better sense of the actual events that happened, but they'll know all of the naturalistic explanations that have been put forward in the academic literature so far, and they'll see why these aren't good explanations. And at the very end, we're going to sum up with the actual argument of the whole book. Like, you sum it up really nicely in that argument, and it looks like it points as, or this would be powerful evidence of something supernatural. Okay.
That's interesting. Yeah, just to riff off that just for a moment. Yeah, because certainly in the New Testament, it is notable that you do get, of course, many claims, or a number of claims of the idea that not only was the resurrected Christ seen, but seen by a whole bunch of people at the same time, and in various contexts, right? Sometimes a small group, sometimes Paul talks about the 500 seeing him at the same time. And so, yeah, and the Bible, of course, more broadly, one of the distinctive things I think about biblical religion more generally is the Bible does make consistent claims of large group religious experiences, right, that you don't find to the same degree in other traditions, right? So if you look at the Old Testament, for example, the people of Israel, look at the Exodus story, for example, or the wanderings in the desert, right? There's routinely these experiences of, the hundreds of thousands of Israelites, seeing the supernatural cloud floating over the tabernacle, or for example, or all the wonders of Mount Sinai, things like this. And so, yeah, this is something that the Judeo-Christian tradition really has a vested interest in, this concept of group religious experiences to a much larger extent than other traditions do. That this is really pretty distinctive of us, it seems to me.
Okay, so what would you say is the central thesis of the book?
The central thesis is pretty limited. It's pretty modest, it seems to me, where what I'm claiming is that these Marian apparitions in Zeitoun, and we can go over the basic outline of the event shortly, but basically the claim is that these Marian apparitions, at the moment, have not been explained in any plausible way using naturalistic explanations, despite quite a few sustained, careful attempts. So at the moment, these events, it seems to me, are positive evidence for the reality of the supernatural. So that's the limited thesis, right? These events have not been naturalistically explained, and so at the moment are pretty good evidence for the existence of something more to reality than the physical realm. So I'm not claiming that this is a rock-solid proof the supernatural exists. That would be too strong a claim. And I'm certainly not claiming that these events are proof that Christianity is true, a much more specific claim. I'm just making a very general claim that these events haven't been well explained so far. So if you're interested in this question of whether or not the supernatural is real, these are some events that would be worth looking at.
Before we get into the events, maybe just to riff off of what you said there a little, people might wonder a couple of things. First, what exactly do you mean by the supernatural? Just God or something like God, spirits? Maybe would you say like paranormal could function just about the same in this case as the word supernatural? Yeah, what do you think about that? And then I'll mention the second one in a second.
Yeah, this is a really important question, and it's one that's often not sort of delved into carefully enough. And actually, in philosophy of religion and metaphysics more generally, that there's a pretty decent literature on this question of, well, how exactly do we define naturalism and then its opposing camp, the supernaturalism, the denial of naturalism? So again, some of this literature can get pretty technical, but as a rough characterization, I think what I would say is that, well, first off, metaphysical naturalism is the claim that the only kind of reality is physical reality. In other words, that the reality is exhausted by the sorts of things people study in physics, right? Space, time, matter, energy. The genuinely real is reducible to the kinds of things studied in physics. I think that would be a fair statement of a naturalist position. I think most naturalists could probably go along with. There's a more careful version of that I would want to give in a different setting, but I think for most purposes that works just fine. And then so the denial of naturalism or the affirmation of supernaturalism would just be the claim that, well, no, there's more to reality than just the physical realm or the sorts of things that are studied by physicists. Now, what that more might consist in, of course, you gave some good examples right there. A God would be a good example of a non-natural entity because God is a spiritual being, conceived of typically as a spiritual being, a non-physical being, or angels, ghosts, the sorts of entities that are typically characterized as supernatural. Where you get, so those would all be examples of sort of supernatural objects or entities, right? And you've also got examples of there's going to be supernatural events or supernatural properties, and you can break it down by different sorts of metaphysical categories. But yeah, I think that would be my initial characterization.
Okay. So the second point, I want to say this up front because viewers might be like, I'm not going to listen to the rest of this interview because he's already shown me the flaw in his whole argument. And they might think you're guilty of, instead of God at the gaps, they might think you're guilty of supernaturalism of the gaps. The fact that we don't have a good natural explanation, they might not even acknowledge that, but they'll say, I grant you that there are no good natural explanations of the events at Zeitoun. That wouldn't in any way point to be good evidence for something supernatural. To think that it would be is to commit supernaturalism of the gaps. What would you say to that sort of pushback?
Yeah, I mean, we do want to guard against the sort of God of the gaps problem that some kinds of arguments do tend to fall into. I think my argument, again, because this would be not God of the gaps exactly, but supernaturalism of the gaps, I guess. But I'm happy to admit in the book that, at least for purposes of my limited thesis, that, again, yeah, this is not a knockdown argument. You could read the book and come away saying that, yeah, at the moment, there's no convincing naturalistic explanations for what happened, but there could be, give it another couple of decades of research, and maybe some, I don't know. I teach a class on religion and the paranormal where I use this as a textbook, and so the example I used in talking about exactly this issue is, well, maybe 30 years from now, some U.S. government documents will be declassified, and it'll turn out that the U.S. military was testing some super sophisticated, holographic technology that nobody realized existed back in the 1960s, and for some bizarre reason they decided to test this at this church in Egypt, and turns out that's what it was. And we find out it was all this bizarre, highly sophisticated hoax that at the moment that seems like an implausible claim because we don't know anything about these secret technologies or whatever. But yeah, I can imagine someone reading the book and saying these events seem really weird. Like, if I were a really committed naturalist, I think what I'd have to say is something like, these events are really weird, and I don't know how to explain them right now. And all the explanations put forward up to now don't seem all that plausible. But, naturalism has a really good evidential base, and I'm not going to give it up easily. And so for the time being, I'm just going to assume that there probably is some explanation for these events that I haven't thought of yet. But I hope it'll be put forward at some point in future. Now, that, I think, is a perfectly rational thing for like a really convinced naturalist to say. I don't have any beef with that kind of a response. What I would say, though, is that is nonetheless a problem for naturalism, right? If the naturalist claim is that ultimately any kind of paranormal or supernatural event will be subject to a naturalistic explanation. And so if you're presented with an event which has been really well studied, but where the explanations don't seem to work, that undermines the evidential status of naturalism to at least some degree. Not enough to overthrow it completely. Again, you can retain your naturalism by just, have the active faith that eventually some explanation will be put forward to, that will work. But in the interim, I think the committed naturalist nevertheless has to be willing to admit that, yeah, this is not enough to overthrow naturalism. You can be a rational naturalist and still deny that these events are supernatural. That's certainly true. But the fact that you can't explain it, even with all the evidential resources that have been poured into trying to explain it, that's a problem. That undermines the evidential status of naturalism to at least some degree. So I think that modest kind of argument is not subject to any kind of supernaturalism of the gaps worries.
Very good. I've done an entire interview on God of the Gaps reasoning and where exactly it fails, what sorts of where you would it would be successful as an objection to an argument and where it can easily be misapplied. So I'll just point viewers to that if they want to see if they're applying it correctly in this case. But now let's actually get into some of the history of the events that happened in Zeitoun, and then we're going to turn to the naturalistic explanations. So just give us a brief sketch of what happened. I think it was 1968 was when the first sighting occurred. So take us back to 1968 and give us an overview.
Yeah, so Zeitoun is a suburb of Cairo. So this is in Egypt. This is in April 2nd, 1968 is the first day of these events. So at the time, this is a St. Mary's or a Coptic Orthodox church in Egypt. Now and maybe if we have time later, I'll say a little bit about what Coptic Orthodoxy is, who the Coptic people are. This is really all very important for their church community. So, but just for the events themselves. So April 2nd, 1968, in the early evening, somewhere between 6:30, 7:30 p.m., there was a public transit station right across the street from the church, and there was a group of Muslim public transit workers who were kind of milling about outside the transit station. And one of the workers, a man named Farouk Muhammad Atwa, he saw a woman all of a sudden atop the church. And this was a highly unusual sight. And initially, he was afraid this might be a nun getting ready to throw herself off the roof. So he started, calling out to this figure on the roof of the church, stay where you are, stay where you are. They called for the authorities, so somebody called the police. But as they walked closer and as a small crowd started to form, what they realized was that this female figure on top of the church was glowing. She was sort of giving off radiant light. And as they got closer, they realized that she seemed to be not just on the roof of the church, but sort of floating on the roof of the church. And so, given that this was St. Mary's Church, this is a glowing female figure above the church. The Virgin Mary was a revered figure in Egyptian Islam at the time, so a recognized religious figure in the Muslim religion as well as the Christian religion. Pretty quickly, a crowd started to form around the church, and they started calling out to the Virgin Mary. So the police were called, they arrived, they were trying to figure out what was going on. Likewise, they alerted one of the priests inside the church, or they alerted the family that was inside the church. And so one of the young boys, came out to see what was going on, and he saw the female figure as well, and then ran to the nearby home of the chief priest of the church to alert him. The chief priest actually on that first night was uninterested. He said, well, just, he decided to stay home and not go and see it, for reasons of his own, and not as any kind of, he wasn't being irreligious or impious or anything. There's a longer story there. But anyway, so a whole bunch of people on that first night saw this female figure who stayed there for a time and then just disappeared. And then some nights later, she spontaneously reappeared. And once again, a large crowd. By that time, news had gotten around in Cairo, so there was rumors of this already floating around. But anyway, she appeared again some nights later, and again, a large crowd formed around the church, and this sort of kept happening on unpredictable, irregular evenings in the succeeding weeks until news had spread through much of Cairo, and pretty soon, you were, within a month or two, you were getting large crowds assembled around the church. So some of the early estimates we have is, tens of thousands of people in the early days who were assembled around the church. And I should stress again that the appearances of this glowing female figure floating above the church were unpredictable and irregular. So on some nights, you'd have tens of thousands of people waiting up all night, assembled around the church, and nothing would happen. And then on other nights, she would appear for, sometimes 5-10 minutes at a time. Other times, she'd be there for hours. And especially on those nights, that's some of the nights where the crowds would really get massive, right? Because word would get out in the neighborhood that the figure had appeared. And if she stayed there for a while, well, then you get, again, many people assembled in just pressing crowds around the church, to the point where the Egyptian government pretty quickly had to take interest in these events just for practical purposes of crowd control. So after a time, they tore down the public transit station across the room for the church to make more room for people who were trying to assemble there. They tore down a lot of the trees that were surrounding the church and making it tougher for some people in the crowds to see properly. So the Egyptian government and the Coptic church had to sort of collaborate on some of these crowd control measures. I should stress as well that it wasn't just the glowing female figure that was being seen. That's the most distinctive, characteristic, seemingly supernatural phenomenon that was taking place here. But there were also, other anomalous lights that were showing up around the church. There were what people described as glowing doves seen flying around the church that would sometimes fly in the formation of a cross. There were anomalous clouds that would just spontaneously appear around the roof of the church. And sometimes the glowing female figure would sort of be formed out of the cloud. Other times she would just appear spontaneously. There was a number of, so one of the interesting things about Zeitoun was that even if we're just talking about the glowing female figure that people were identifying as the Virgin Mary, she would appear in variable ways on different evenings, right? So sometimes she would just sort of appear spontaneously. Other times, people describe this situation where they could see a line of light. Like an analogy some of the eyewitnesses used was like, if you're in a dark room and you're looking underneath a doorway where the room on the other side is lit, you get this sort of strip of light at the bottom of the doorway. They use that as an analogy to describe sometimes the figure would appear initially as like a strip of light that would then grow into the full female figure. And other times, again, you'd get this anomalous cloud that would appear and then form gradually into this luminous female figure, right? So very divergent phenomena on different evenings sometimes. The eyewitnesses were often adamant that this was a three-dimensional figure, right? In other words, this was not some kind of like image being projected onto the roof of the church, because a number of eyewitnesses were, again, specifically stressed this. This was not, from what they could tell, this was not any kind of projection. This was a three-dimensional figure. Different eyewitnesses would sometimes report varying levels of detail. And, it's because these events were ongoing, right? Because these events went on for roughly 3 years, again, at irregular intervals, with varying crowd sizes on different evenings. Some of the variation in what people were seeing might have been that just the figure appeared differently on different evenings. Some of the variation may have been that, particularly in terms of variations in levels of detail. So sometimes you have eyewitnesses who were claiming that they could discern facial features on this glowing female figure. At other times, eyewitnesses would say no, that they could see the general outline of the woman, but they couldn't see anything more detailed. Sometimes that might have been because the figure was actually appearing differently. At other times, it might have just been a feature of more prosaic perceptual factors, right? Some people were closer to the church. If you've got 50,000 people assembled around the church, some are going to be closer than others. Some of them are going to have better vantage points than others. Also, if you look at the further sort of complication in that respect, is if you look at photographs of the roof of this church in Zeitoun, it's got multiple domes. And so sometimes, depending on where the figure was situated, she might be behind a dome, so people on one side of the church wouldn't be able to see her for a while. Then she would move to another side of the church so other people could see her. They also described her as definitely being like animate, right? So she would gesture to the crowd, she would bow to the crowd, she would bless the crowds, right? She was engaging in obviously intelligent activities. But one of the distinctive things about Zeitoun that separates it apart from many other Marian apparitions, especially if you look at the history of apparitions in like the Roman Catholic Church, is that this figure in Zeitoun never spoke or communicated any message to people. Or at least she never verbally, explicitly communicated a message. Obviously, the Coptic people had, interpretations of why she was there, what she was doing. They had their own views on the meaning of the events, but the figure herself never actually explicitly communicated to anyone. Anyway, so just to say a bit more about the historical outline for these events. So again, they began in 1968 in April. The historical context is sort of notable. Egypt had lost a major war the previous year, a 6-day war, when Egypt and Syria and Jordan all invaded Israel and were beaten. This is a rough time for the Egyptian people, right? They'd lost the war, the economy is in a really bad place, and the Coptic Christian minority, which at the time was, I think, around 10% of the population of Egypt, the Coptic Christian minority was being scapegoated for the loss of the war. There were rumors floating around that Coptic soldiers who'd fought on behalf of Egypt in the war were actually secret sympathizers with Israel and had sabotaged the war effort. So there were these rumors floating around that the Copts were to blame for this terrible, what the Egyptians saw as this terrible loss in the 6-day war. And so as this animosity towards the Coptic people grew, there started to be real worries about persecution. The Coptic people have faced, over time, that sometimes things have been better, at other times they've been worse, but certainly at some points in Coptic history, they've faced brutal persecution within Egypt by the Muslim majority. And there was definite worries, very rational worries, that the Coptic community was facing an impending major persecution. And so in the midst of those persecution fears, all of a sudden you get this Marian apparition. And one of the interpretations that some Coptic folk have put on these events is that, well, they happened basically to preserve the Coptic people, right? Because when these events began, they ended up forming an almost unprecedented degree of like ecumenical harmony in Egypt, right? Because you got Muslims who were assembling around the church to see the Virgin Mary, whom they also revered. You had the Coptic community, you had the smaller Catholic and Protestant communities in Egypt that would come out to see these events. It became a kind of unifying force across Egypt of interreligious unity, and that sort of tamped down the animosity against the Copts, and in fact sparked a religious revival in Egypt that became extremely influential in the succeeding years, both in the Coptic community and to a lesser extent also in the Muslim community. But anyway, so just to give you a little bit more context for the historical situation of these events when they began. Again, they continued for months, and as they continued, the Coptic church authorities made an official investigation into the events to try to figure out what was going on. So the Coptic Patriarch, Kyrillos VI, appointed a church commission to go to Zeitoun and investigate these events. And all the members of the church investigatory community also saw the apparition, which is unprecedented in the history of Marian apparitions. They also saw the event. They reported back to the Pope. They felt this, the Coptic Pope, that they felt that these events were actually the Virgin Mary. And so the Coptic Church, after a relatively brief period of investigation, declared that these events were real, that this was really the Virgin Mary appearing in the church. They also appointed a medical commission to investigate the many reports of miraculous healings that were being reported during these events. So people would go to the apparition site, pray to the Virgin Mary, or pray to God at the apparition site, and then find themselves miraculously healed. The very first miraculous healing reported, actually, in the Zeitoun events. So I mentioned that the very first person who saw the glowing female figure atop the church was a fellow named Muhammad Farooq Atwa. And on the night that he saw the glowing female figure for the first time, he was scheduled to have one of his fingers amputated because it had become gangrenous. And that was the figure he pointed at, this woman atop the church, right? And then not long after that event where he saw this glowing female figure, he went back to his doctor to remove the bandages and prepare to amputate the finger, and the doctor found it was completely healed. And he reported this to the Coptic Church Commission that was investigating all these reports of miraculous healings. And these were the sorts of healings that really impressed people in Egypt, right? Because there were Muslims who were reporting these miraculous healings. And moreover, just as a side note, obviously, and you've probably done shows on this yourself, miraculous healings are a big topic. There's lots of debate about to what extent claims of miraculous healings can have naturalistic explanations or psychosomatic explanations, like the placebo effect. Just one sort of footnote to that first reported healing in Zeitoun. Gangrene is not something you can heal psychosomatically, right? You've got a gangrenous limb, it needs to be amputated, right? This is not something that is normally considered to be a good candidate for a psychosomatic healing, right? So just to underline that. Anyway, so these events continued. The Coptic Church investigated them. The Egyptian government investigated them. And amazingly, the Egyptian government also came out and said, yeah, this is the Virgin Mary. They couldn't find any naturalistic explanation. So the government just said, yeah, we think the Virgin Mary is appearing at this Coptic church. Which, the government, a secular government in a Muslim majority country is a pretty remarkable thing to come out with. So these events continued. They got lots of media attention within Egypt, lots of newspaper coverage within Egypt, and to some extent within the wider Arab world. They got some media attention internationally. So the New York Times did a story on this in the early period of the events. It made it into the Reuters wire service. There's a number of newspaper reports in the Western media, but not as many as you'd expect, given how long these events continued and how many people were witnessing them. Anyway, so the events continued over the main period where the events were most frequent and where the crowds were largest, really roughly the first year and a half. Going into 1970 and then 1971, the frequency of the events definitely starts to decline, and the number of witnesses start to decline, in part just because the crowds start to diminish over time as the events become less frequent. You still do get some dramatic sightings in 1970 and 1971, but generally the frequency declines, and eventually they sort of taper off. The last publicly reported sighting is in 1971. And so the events then sort of conclude. But since then, they've taken on quite an important status in Coptic Orthodox devotional life. So the April 2nd, the first day of the apparitions, is an official feast day on the Coptic Orthodox liturgical calendar. And these events are again well known in the Coptic community. If you go into any Coptic Orthodox church in Canada or the United States and talk to someone who's over 60, there's a pretty good chance that person either saw the apparition themselves or has a close friend or family member that did. Again, there were so many witnesses, right? The numbers vary, just how many people witness these seemingly supernatural events. I've seen widely varying estimates, but probably the most reliable general estimate is roughly 1 million people saw something at the Zeitoun church over the course of these 3 years. And again, widely known, widely talked about within the Coptic community. And yeah, so there is at least some academic literature that delves into these events, trying to explain what was going on. And that's the literature that I focus on to some degree in the book, but I also, of course, give a wide selection. If you're interested just in getting a sense of what these events were like, I give a pretty wide sampling of first-person eyewitness reports as well.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful to give people a sense of the sorts of events and what the witnesses were claiming they saw. So this was over an extended period of time, a three-year period. The frequency diminished over time, but it was on several occasions, thousands of witnesses at once. It sounded like you threw out the number 10,000 would be gathered all at once, and maybe even more than that over
Yeah,
the
well,
course of time. Yeah,
yeah,
continue.
just to note there, so of the Egyptian newspaper reports I've read from the time, the largest, for a single evening, the largest crowd estimate I saw in the newspaper reports was 250,000 on one of
Oh,
the
wow.
apparition event evenings.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that was one night.
Yeah. So that number of witnesses on a single occasion, the fact that the figure appears differently on different occasions in different spots on the church. Sometimes it's formed out of a cloud, sometimes out of like light. Other objects are forming out of light. Figure doesn't speak. So I'm just recapping there. People have a sense of what was being seen, or at least what people claim they saw. So now I want to turn to the naturalistic explanations. And at the end of the book, I found this helpful. You said naturalistic explanations of these events will have to do one or more of these three things. So it's like three options. And you can combine them, but at minimum, you got to do at least one of these if you're going to do a naturalistic explanation. The first is appeal to individual psychological mechanisms of the crowd members. The second option is to appeal to collective psychological mechanisms of the crowd. And then the third option is appeal to a purely extrinsic, non psychological explanatory factor. So I guess I'm thinking of it kind of like you have a decision to make. You can say there's psychological explanations and something non psychological. If you say psychological explanation, you can cash it out in terms of just purely something going on at the level of individuals, or you can say something going on collectively. And again, you could combine these. You can say like all three things are happening at once, but at bare minimum, those are like your options. I'm not really sure what a fourth would be. It seems like that captures the spread of possible naturalistic explanations. So I thought maybe with the time that's left, we could just go through each kind of category there, each of those three categories, and you could summarize, how someone might attempt to explain those events, and then your objections to that naturalistic explanation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good, clear recap of those major options. Thank you. Yeah, so on an individual level, so there's some authors who have taken roughly that approach. So there's a Canadian sociologist, Michael Carroll, who wrote a book on Marian apparitions, trying to explain them using the resources of Freudian psychoanalytic theory, basically. Most of his book is spent explaining, applying that Freudian theory to private Marian apparitions. But he also has some sections where he talks about group apparitions, including Zeitoun, where what's interesting though is that even Carroll, whose project is really to provide an individual level psychological explanation, is he feels the need to actually make a kind of combination explanation, right? So Carroll suggests that, well, what's going on with Zeitoun is you've got some kind of unknown weather anomaly, some kind of unknown meteorological anomaly, or there's some sort of anomalous light source that is real, that people are actually seeing, but that people are misinterpreting as the Virgin Mary, in part because of maybe cultural factors, right, the cultural expectations, but also because of the sort of Freudian dynamics that he explores at the individual level. So that kind of explanation, I think, of course, immediately raises the question of, well, wait a second, what's the meteorological anomaly, or what's the source of this strange light that people are seeing? If there is really a strange light, I can't imagine how it could be a weather phenomenon, because it would be a weather phenomenon isolated to the roof of a church on multiple evenings over several years, and there is no such meteorological phenomenon. And if you just say, well, it's some kind of anomalous light, well, you can say that, but you haven't explained anything. And so you sort of just push the explanatory can down the road, or whatever it is. So I think for a set of events like this, anything that would rely strictly on an individual psychological explanation is immediately going to be unsuccessful. When it comes to collective psychological explanations, the first option most people would think of would be something like the generic notion of a mass hallucination. However, in psychology, there is no generally recognized phenomenon of mass hallucination, right? This is a term people throw out sometimes, but there is no literature in psychology suggesting that you can get a situation where hundreds of thousands of people see the same thing at the same time, and there's some kind of psychological mechanism accounting for this. There is no such literature. There is no psychological phenomenon. This is just a label that shows up. There's a Harvard psychologist, Tim Lomas, who's done some work recently on psychology and the paranormal, who makes this point very nicely. Unfortunately, as his work appeared too late for me to include a reference to it in the book, but he's got a very nice discussion of this. Tim Lomas, Lomas, at the Harvard psychology faculty. So group hallucination doesn't really exist as a general phenomenon. However, there is a kind of explanation which is more interesting, which is, again, a kind of combination explanation of the sort you mentioned earlier, which is known as tectonic strain theory. This is a tectonic strain theory. This is a theory developed by another Canadian, a neuroscientist and psychologist named Michael Persinger. So Persinger's theory, he originally developed this as an explanation for the UFO phenomenon, and then he came to expand the theory to account for a wider variety. He came to think of it as a kind of grand unified theory of the paranormal and religious experiences as well. So Persinger's theory is roughly this, and he wrote a paper on Zeitoun where he applied the theory specifically to these events. So Persinger's theory is roughly this. So we are constantly surrounded by electromagnetic activity in the general ambient environment. And this electromagnetic activity can vary in strength and wavelength and things depending on a whole variety of environmental factors. One of those environmental factors is, he claims, tectonic strain. So the earth beneath us, if you've got tectonic activity going on that's significant, this can affect what's happening above ground in the electromagnetic ambient environment. This is what gives rise to what's called earthquake lights. Now, earthquake lights are actually a pretty widely recognized phenomenon in geology, where if you've got an earthquake, the massive tectonic forces going on, again, can actually give rise to flashing lights in the sky in the immediate vicinity of the earth where the earthquake is happening. It's called earthquake lights. It's a recognized thing in geology. What Persinger wanted to do, though, was take that basic idea of earthquake lights and build on it. So his suggestion is that even lower levels of tectonic activity, like well below the level of an earthquake, might give rise to anomalous lights in the sky, right? Again, by affecting the electromagnetic activity in the atmosphere, in the ambient environment. And he claimed to theorize as well that this can happen over a much larger region, right? So again, earthquake lights are a pretty narrow phenomenon, right? If you have an earthquake, you might get some weird lights in the sky right in the immediate vicinity of the earthquake while the earthquake's happening. That's the original notion of earthquake lights. Persinger expands this to think that much lower levels of tectonic strain can give rise to anomalous lights months before major tectonic activity, or months after tectonic activity, or hundreds of miles away from major tectonic activity, right? So he really expands the reach of the idea that tectonic activity can give rise to these anomalous lights. But that's the basic idea. So Persinger thinks what's going on, there were real lights at Zeitoun, and they're explained by unusually high levels of tectonic activity in Egypt at the time. And he consulted the geophysical records in Egypt, and he thought he could discern a correlation that there was, within 400 kilometers of the apparition site, there was certain levels of tectonic activity going on that he thought were abnormal for Egypt at the time. And so he hypothesized that might have been giving rise to anomalous lights. But that's just one component of tectonic strain theory. That's the anomalous light side of the theory. The other aspect of tectonic strain theory is what this electromagnetic activity can also do to us psychologically. So Persinger posited something called temporal lobe lability. Temporal lobe lability. So the temporal lobe is a region of the brain, and it's been hypothesized for a while that certain kinds of hallucinations are rooted in temporal lobe activity, particularly things like temporal lobe epilepsy. There are certain forms of epilepsy where people can experience perceptual hallucinations or illusions, and that's thought to be rooted in temporal lobe activity. Now, Persinger's hypothesis was that the temporal lobe can be influenced by ambient electromagnetic activities. Again, certain wavelengths or strengths of electromagnetic radiation can affect the temporal lobe, and in certain people who are particularly vulnerable, this ambient electromagnetic activity can affect the temporal lobe and give rise to hallucinations. So here's the causal nexus, basically, that Persinger is putting forward, right? You've got unusually high tectonic strain in Egypt. That causes weird lights in the sky that really exist. Combine that with a certain percentage of the population is going to be vulnerable to hallucinations when you get that tectonic strain that's affecting the electromagnetic activity. So what happened, he thought, was that these apparitions in Egypt were resulted from a combination of real lights appearing in the sky, resulting from this electromagnetic activity being influenced by tectonic strain. That same electromagnetic activity is also fueling people's hallucinations. So they see these weird lights, they already believe in the Virgin Mary, and a certain percentage of them, their temporal lobes are being flooded with this excessive levels of electromagnetic activity. So the lights combined with their own vulnerable temporal lobes are giving rise to hallucinations. They share a common cultural background. What are they going to think they're hallucinating? They think they're seeing the Virgin Mary. So roughly stated, that's Persinger's explanation for Zeitoun.
Let me throw in one additional consideration in an attempt to kind of strengthen the plausibility of that explanation. My viewers may or may not be aware of something called the God helmet. So this is this helmet that you can put on, and it can actually induce, like they send certain signals that hit the brain, and it can induce religious experiences in people. So the idea that there could, we have a helmet that can do this. The idea that there'd be something in the environment that can do it as well might be like, okay, I can see some plausibility to that. Okay,
exactly.
I just thought I'd throw that out.
One of the supporting lines of evidence that Persinger presented for tectonic strain theory was his laboratory experiments with the God helmet, or what became known as the God helmet, right? So Persinger was sort of a co-inventor for this. And basically the God helmet, if you Google it, it basically looks like a motorcycle helmet or a football helmet, only with a whole bunch of like solenoids attached to it. Like the sorts of things you might get if you're having like an ECG exam or something. And only here it's attached to the football helmet, and tape over the eyes, right? So you're sort of put in a sensory deprivation chamber. You wear the God helmet. What the God helmet does is it floods your cranium with certain particular wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. And Persinger thought that a certain percentage of people with vulnerable temporal lobes, when their brains are flooded with these wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, that'll prompt hallucinations in them. And so what he found was that a certain percentage of people in his neuroscience lab undergoing these experiments, when they left the chamber, they would report that they had weird experiences wearing this helmet, right? They'd report they might have felt a presence or smelled something weird or even saw something. Occasionally it had people reporting more detailed hallucinations. And so, so that was an important part of Persinger's wider case for the truth of tectonic strain theory. So thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah. So that's basically Persinger's explanation. So in the book, what I do is, again, I give an overview of tectonic strain theory. I give an overview of how Persinger applied it to Zeitoun. And then I give kind of a twofold critique. So one kind of critique I put forward is just assuming that tectonic strain theory in general is a potentially workable explanation for religious experiences or the paranormal. Does it explain Zeitoun? So that's the first kind of issue I look at. And what I argue is that no, even if tectonic strain theory in general is potentially plausible, it does not explain Zeitoun for a couple of reasons. One reason is that it does not account for the narrow localization of the events. So if tectonic strain theory should explain what's happening in Zeitoun, what you should expect is that you'd get increased reports of weird lights and hallucinations all across Egypt. You certainly wouldn't expect that these events would be localized to the roof of a single church in a single neighborhood. It just doesn't explain that feature of the events. Moreover, it really does not account for the consistency of eyewitness reports, right? Where you get, again, thousands of people assembled in front of the church at the same time in the same place, reporting not just amorphous lights, but reporting pretty consistent, detailed sightings of a female-shaped figure behaving in very lifelike ways, moving around the church. And again, if you compare, so in the book I give some examples of multiple eyewitness reports from the very same evening, where again you can compare what people were seeing on a given night, and again you can see a pretty strong levels of consistency in some cases, where again this is just not what you would expect from tectonic strain theory, or this is not what you would expect from weird amorphous lights being produced by geological activity combined with private hallucinations. You would not get that level of consistency. So for those reasons and some others, I don't think the tectonic strain theory would work for Zeitoun, even if it works for like UFOs or other kinds of paranormal events. All that said, tectonic strain theory as itself does not really work as a theory. There have been some very strong critiques put forward, and especially in the last decade, of Persinger's work. One kind of criticism is the geological aspect of the theory, right? The idea that low levels of tectonic strain hundreds of miles away might give rise to weird lights at a given location. There's just no good geological evidence for this. Moreover, when it comes to the neuroscientific aspect of his theory, his work has been heavily criticized by other neuroscientists in the last decade, in part because when they tried to replicate his experiments with the God helmet, they found they couldn't. So there was a team of neuroscientists in Sweden about a decade ago that tried to replicate Persinger's experiments, where they replicated how the equipment worked under guidance from Persinger. And they were in fact expecting they would get similar results, right? That if you put people in a sensory deprivation chamber and put them in this helmet and flood their cranium with this particular wavelengths of electromagnetic activity, that a certain percentage of them would have hallucinatory experiences. That just didn't happen. And in trying to explain why they couldn't replicate Persinger's results, they hypothesized that, well, one of the notable differences in their experiment is that, so Persinger, when he would run his experiments, he would begin by giving his undergrad students a personality assessment that tested them for levels of belief in the paranormal. So they'd have a bunch of questions in this assessment about the paranormal and religious belief. So doing the assessment before going into the chamber primed students to realize they were being tested about something to do with the paranormal. And that was not the case in the Swedish replication experiments. So they hypothesized that this is basically that what people were experiencing in Persinger's experiments were the result of basically suggestion, right? People will vary in their level of suggestibility. And if you make a strong suggestion to someone that if you were going to put you in the sensory deprivation chamber for a while, hey, let us know if anything weird happens. Well, that'll prime them to maybe have something, they'll expect something weird might happen and their mind might generate something, right? And a certain percentage of people, just in general, people in a sensory deprivation chamber, they might have some weird experiences. So anyway, that was one criticism of Persinger. And there were other replication experiments in the years since that likewise could not replicate Persinger's results. They also ran some replication experiments where they put people in one group. So they divided the experimental group into two groups. One group would have a real God helmet, right, where there was really flooding their craniums with this electromagnetic activity, and the other group would have a sham God helmet, where they just wouldn't turn on the equipment, right? So they would have no electromagnetic activity going through their cranium. And so they ran these two groups, and the two groups had no difference in the level of strange experiences they reported. So once again, the thought was, well, this is probably just a product of suggestibility. Other neuroscientists pointed out that the level of electromagnetic activity that Persinger was using in his experiments was lower than you would get from your cell phone or from a hairdryer. And so it's not even clear that this level of electromagnetic activity can succeed in affecting the brain, let alone affecting this alleged temporal lobe lability. Temporal lobe lability, by the way, is not a well-known or recognized concept in neuroscience. This is something that Persinger himself came up with. It was never experimentally verified. That was another line of criticism. So it's just, in the neuroscience literature in the intervening decades, there's just a whole range of criticisms that arose. Persinger did try to respond to some of these critiques. I don't think he was very successful, and unfortunately passed away. And he does still have defenders, some defenders in the literature, particularly in the realm of paranormal research. But I think his theory has taken some really major hits.
As an attempt to take some of his work and say, well, some of those objections are good and some not, somebody might think that the suggestibility piece, the suggestibility of objection that you raised, so hey, before you put these students in the God helmet, you kind of primed them a little. You gave them these questions about paranormal and, hey, if you see anything, then let me know. He might think, I don't know if he said this or not, but someone might say, well, Zeitoun's a perfect example of prime. I mean, it's both the location of it kind of tells you what you might expect. It's a Coptic Orthodox church that venerates Mary. So they're already primed in that aspect if they see some lights. And then especially once a few people start gathering and saying, do you see that? Do you see that? Then you might fall, crowds might gather and they're experiencing something, but because through the power of suggestion, they say that it's Mary. What do you say about that?
That's a great question. Yeah. Well, what I say in the book is that, and I would still stick to this, is that doesn't fit well with the data, right? Because what we find is that, so for example, it doesn't fit with the inconsistency and variability, right? So you get 10,000 people crowded around the church with a high level of expectation. They're psychologically primed. They want to see something, and nothing happens, and everybody goes home disappointed. And then 3 nights later, you got this dramatic event, right? So you got arguably the same psychological context across various nights, but very different claims about what people were seeing. Moreover, if you look at the eyewitness reports, there are lots of folks who say, they went one night and they were really disappointed they didn't see anything. They went the next night and, heard the people on the other side of the church were seeing something, but they couldn't see anything, and the crowd was so full they couldn't move around the other side of the church, and so they left really disappointed. But they went back a week later, and this glowing female figure was floating above the church for 3 hours, right? And so, again, the suggestibility or the priming objection, I think, just does not account for what the eyewitness reports reveal at an individual level. So, yeah, I think anybody who delves through the eyewitness accounts, whether in my book or some of the other books on Zeitoun, I think they'll come away recognizing that the psychological priming explanation does not work well for these events.
So to sum up, because we've hit the 1 hour mark, I'd like to go ahead and wrap up. You give this argument at the end of the book, and I thought that was such a great summary of what you're doing. So can you just maybe, you don't necessarily have to read the argument word for word, but what that argument is, like lay that out for us, how you reach the conclusion of this is probably a supernatural phenomenon?
Yeah, well, I think the argument was something. Yeah, I do give a kind of, being a philosopher, I like formal premise conclusion arguments. I give one briefly in the last chapter of the book. And the argument is something like, if a seemingly supernatural event has been well studied and no naturalistic explanation, convincing naturalistic explanation has been put forward, then that provides some evidence for the reality of the supernatural. Well, Zeitoun is just such an event. It's a good example of such an event. And so we have some evidence that, for the truth of the reality of the supernatural or for the falsity of naturalism, something like that. But of course, again, the way I frame it, I recognize that this is not a foolproof argument. It's a probabilistic argument, what philosophers sometimes refer to as an abductive argument, or like an inference to the best explanation, right? In other words, given our present level of evidence, there's good reason to think that these events don't have a naturalistic explanation. So that's evidence against naturalism. It's not foolproof evidence. We might get better naturalistic explanations sometime in the future. And I hope one effect of the book will be to encourage naturalists to dig into these events more and try to come up with better naturalistic explanations, right? Move the dialogue forward. I don't want to discourage, other attempts to explain these things naturalistically. But actually, just on this point about naturalistic explanations, just since I referenced it briefly earlier, I do also have a chapter on the possibility of technological hoaxes. And so just briefly, what I claim in the book is that there was no technology available in 1960s Egypt that would have been capable of hoaxing these events, given what people were reporting. Holograms are the most obvious potential explanation, but holographic technology had only just been invented. The stuff just came out in the early 1960s. Moreover, holograms can't move. Holograms are always stationary, and so this doesn't account for the motion and the animation that people were reporting for this figure. Moreover, there were no good suspects for who might have been running the hoax, right? So I consider the possibility, well, might the Coptic Orthodox Church hierarchy have done this for their own reasons? And I dismiss that as really implausible. Likewise, there have actually been some folks who suggest, well, maybe the Egyptian government faked this to bring in tourist dollars. And I just find that wildly implausible, right? So just to run with that just for a moment, right? If you're a cash-strapped government that wants to bring in tourist dollars, and you're governing a nation that's 90% Muslim, surrounded by other 95% plus Muslim nations, are you going to fake a Marian apparition at a Christian church? No, you're going to fake like a appearance of the angel Gabriel above a mosque or something like this. That's the way you're going to try to bring in Muslim pilgrims or whatever to your nation. So I think there's no good candidate for who might have been doing the hoaxes, and there's no good candidate for how this might have been done technologically.
I didn't think I'd throw this one in, but the idea crossed my mind as you were speaking. So I told you I initially got interested in this through studying evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. What somebody like Bart Ehrman and it seems like David Hume might say is, hey, any explanation, no matter how implausible it is going to be better than some kind of supernatural explanation. So I'm just curious, what might you say to somebody that says that tectonic strain theory, it's full of holes, but it's better than a supernatural explanation? That's the least probable one of all.
Yeah. Well, I think for some people that's going to be a perfectly rational response. It all depends on what kind of naturalist they are, how thoroughly convinced they are of naturalism, right? So imagine you're someone like Richard Dawkins, who thinks that not only is naturalism true, but supernaturalism is absurd, right? Belief in God is on the same level as belief in leprechauns or the flying spaghetti monster, right? If that's what somebody believes about supernaturalism, well, then of course any natural explanation is always going to be preferable to a supernatural explanation, right? So I think somebody like Richard Dawkins could read my book and come away totally unmoved and be rationally totally unmoved, right? Because we all make probability assessments based on our background beliefs. That's inevitable, right? So if somebody approaches something like this with the background belief that the truth of naturalism is 100% because the supernatural is just crazy, yeah, of course they're going to have to say, well, I mean, however absurd the naturalistic explanation so far, there's got to be some naturalistic explanation. And from their perspective, that'll be rational, right? Because that's the priors with which they're approaching this issue. However, I think a slightly less convinced naturalist, let's say we take somebody who's only like 90% convinced that naturalism is true. Like they think naturalism is extremely probable. For them, it's a very fixed belief, but they grant it's conceivable it might be false, and that that they're willing to accord some small weight to the possibility it could be false. That more modest kind of naturalism, I think, should be at least a little bit perturbed by this evidence. I think the evidence is good enough that it should at least give that person pause and make them, at the very least, it should give them motivation to try to seek out better naturalistic explanations for these sorts of events. Just faith in the fact that there must be some explanation, I don't think is going to be good enough for that kind of naturalist. So again, it just depends on their prior probability assessments and the kind of background beliefs they're approaching the discussion with.
I want to thank St. Vladimir's Seminary Press for providing me a copy of the book. The link to purchase a copy of the book is in the description below. If you enjoyed this interview, then check out this video with Dr. Dumsday, where we explore other evidentially compelling religious experiences.